Welcome back to our flagship studios here in San Francisco at the JP Morgan Health Conference. I am delighted to introduce David Fajgenbaum, who Nubar and others of us from Flagship got to meet at the Clinton Global Initiative earlier this year and have developed a relationship with. We're so inspired by his work and his book, which will be a topic of conversation between David and Alltrna CEO Michelle Werner after a presentation by David. Dr. Fajgenbaum, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. We've tried everything. There's nothing more that we can do. I heard those words from my doctors, but I didn't really understand what they meant until my family came into the room to say their final goodbyes, and a priest read me my last rites. I was 25 years old. Just 6 months earlier, I was a former college quarterback and a medical student trained to become an oncologist in memory of my mom when I became critically ill with the rare and deadly Castleman Disease. In a last-ditch effort to save my life, my doctors had given me a combination of 7 different chemotherapies. Somehow I survived, but I would go on to relapse and nearly die 4 more times in the next 3 years. And I knew it was unlikely that I could survive another one. My only hope would be to find an existing drug that could be repurposed to treat my disease. I knew it was possible because many diseases share the same underlying mechanisms and can therefore be treated with the same drug. And I knew it was my only chance because I didn't have a decade and $1 billion to try to find a new drug from scratch. So I began testing my own samples in the lab. And from weeks and weeks of experiments, a drug emerged, sirolimus. It had been around for decades, but had never been used before for my disease. I began testing it on myself as the first patient ever with my disease. And January 5th, just a few days ago, marked 9 years that I've been in remission on this drug after nearly dying 5 times in 3 years. Thank you. During this remission, I married the love of my life, Caitlin. We had 2 beautiful children, Amelia and baby David. I wrote a book about my journey chasing my cure, and I joined the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania to continue to chase more and more cures. We've already discovered and advanced 10 more repurposed drugs for Castleman disease and for cancer, as well as COVID-19 treatments. These patients photographed today are alive today because of a drug that was not developed for their disease, but that we identified and repurposed to save their lives. And we are so thankful for the progress we've made, but so much more work still needs to be done. See, humankind has developed about 3,000 drugs for about 3,000 diseases. But unfortunately, there are still another 9,000 diseases that don't have a single FDA-approved therapy. 9,000. That means that 1 in 10 of each of us either has or will develop a disease without a single drug. And 1/3 of these kids won't even survive to kindergarten. Since it takes over $1 billion in 10 years typically to develop a new drug from scratch, I didn't have the time to wait, and neither do these patients. So even though repurposing existing drugs is faster and less expensive than new drug development, and there's often data that already exists to connect drugs with diseases, cures like my own sit on the pharmacy shelf for decades because of 3 systemic barriers. First, there's no centralized database linking together drugs and the diseases that they may be able to treat. Secondly, there are insufficient incentives or business models for companies to develop new uses for existing drugs, especially when those drugs are generic or the disease is rare. And finally, no organization is responsible for ensuring that drugs are utilized for all of the diseases they can treat. Not the FDA, not the NIH, not pharmaceutical companies, no one until recently. This September, as you heard earlier, we launched an organization called EveryCure and everycure.org, which is on a mission to unlock the full potential of each and every drug to treat each and every disease possible. Together with partners across the healthcare landscape, we're building a comprehensive open source database of drug repurposing opportunities so we can begin to save lives right away. Since our launch, we've already received over $4 million worth of donated data sets, as well as $500,000 worth of seed funding, which has helped us to unlock 497 promising drug repurposing opportunities just in our first 3 months alone of looking. So now we're in the process of raising an additional $9.4 million for funding over the next 3 years to build the world's largest AI-driven engine to unlock hundreds and hundreds of more drug repurposing opportunities. Let's see. And so through our approach, it's about both utilizing existing publicly available data that already links drugs and diseases along with proprietary data that we now have access to, and also expert insights from pharmaceutical companies and organizations like Flagship that can share insights that this drug might be useful for this disease. And with every $1 to $5 million additional raised, we'll perform efficient clinical trials of the most promising drugs from our database in patients to prove that these drugs actually work. And since 90% of drugs are already generic and therefore accessible and cheap, we have an incredible opportunity to make a major impact globally on health equity. There is no greater return on investment in terms of saving lives than what we're doing through every cure. We announced this initiative this past September at the Clinton Global Initiative. You can see me and President Clinton doing a Castleman flex. And since then, President Clinton has been a huge supporter of what we're doing and helping to spread the word. And since then, you can imagine that we've been contacted by a number of families of Castleman disease, COVID, cancer, and so many different rare disease patients reaching out, asking for solutions. You know, what about this drug for maybe my child? Or have you found a drug that could work for my kid? We've turned to the donated data sets that we've received, and we found some promising approaches for these children, but unfortunately we realized that we have to fully build out this engine so that we have the full-blown capability to be able to identify drugs for patients like Lisa and Gary and Baker, who are all photographed on the screen. Spending time with these families and reflecting back on my own journey, celebrating 9 years just a few days ago, I realized that I'm not supposed to be here, and I don't know how much longer I will be, but as long as I'm alive and as long as there's patients like these waiting for us to find existing drugs that could be repurposed to save their lives, we're going to continue to chase those cures, but we can't do it alone. We need 3 things urgently. The first is funding to build out this team and data engine so we can find new uses for existing drugs. The second is organizations like Flagship that we can partner with to identify the most promising opportunities to move forward. And finally, it's tech partners to fully leverage the power of AI. So I hope you all will join me on our search to uncover every cure so that no one is ever told we've tried everything when there's a life-saving cure on the pharmacy shelf. Thank you all so, so much. Michelle, please join me up here. Thank you.
Have a seat.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for being here. It's really just an honor to be in your presence. And as you know, I've been spending the last few months pouring through your book, and I will share that for me, it really resonated tremendously.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. I'm so happy to be here with you. And I have to say, that might be one of the most well-annotated copies of Chasing My Cure that I've seen. So
Yeah.
Really excited to chat today.
And what I will say is that for me, one of the things that I really loved about this book, but also terrified me, is how similar it was to my own story and some of the experiences that you've been through. And maybe just to share a little bit about my own background, right?
Yeah.
So I am the CEO of Alltrna and a CEO partner at Flagship Pioneering. That's my day job. But my other day job is a wife and a mom. And I'm not a patient, but I am a caregiver. And I've also been through a similar experience of being faced with a devastating diagnosis that really changes the trajectory of my life, changed the trajectory of my life. And for those of you that don't know, and maybe just a little bit of context, so I have 3 children. They're between the ages of 11 and 15. And 2.5 years ago, on my now 12-year-old, but his 10th birthday, we got a diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And the floor just dropped out from underneath us. We fell into what I call the black hole of despair, grieving for a future that we, of course, had sort of envisioned for him, for all of our kids, and realizing that that future may not be possible. and the devastation that comes with something like that, probably similar to how it was with you being on your deathbed, perhaps a couple of times.
Absolutely.
And once we recovered from being in that black hole, we started to think about what it is that we can do and how do we turn that feeling into one of action and to really make a difference. And not just for our own son, but for others as well, other kids out there as well. And I think this is a little bit about what we can talk about today, because I think there's a lot of similarities between what you're doing, what we're hoping to do, and why don't we start there?
I'd love that. One, I'm so devastated by what you and your family have had to go through, but since we've spoken, I've been so inspired by what you are doing, by the action that you're taking. So thanks for sharing that with me and with the audience, and excited to chat about the questions you have.
Great. So I want to start with really talking about some of the range of emotions,
Yeah.
right? You talk about in your own story the feeling of hope, but also grief.
Yep.
And how that was a real catalyst for action. And for me, as you heard, it came from more of a place of hopelessness. So I don't know, is it hope? Is it grief? Is it hopelessness?
Yeah, I think that, I guess it's all relative. And so when I think about my journey, there were moments where I felt hopeless, but because I believed in the power of science and medicine, it made me feel that maybe there was a 1 in a million chance that maybe we could find a drug that was out there. And so, one person may look at a 1 in a million chance and say, well, then you're completely hopeless. But you could also look at a 1 in a million chance and saying, okay, so you're saying that there's a chance and that maybe there is some hope there. And I think that for me, that little bit of hope that maybe there's a chance I could have a family with Caitlin, we could get married one day, I could continue to chase cures in memory of my mom, that little bit of a chance really drove my action. And in the book, we talk about this cycle, virtuous cycle of hope and action. So you hope a little bit, you have hope for a future with your family, the people you love, and that can drive you to take action. And then that action can maybe lead to a success that can give you more hope. And this sort of cycle of hope and action. But I don't know, what do you think? 1 in a million odds, is that enough to feel like there's hope there? Or is it feeling like, that's just basically hopelessness?
I mean, I'm right now choosing to focus on hope, right? I definitely went through a period of time where it felt very hopeless. Yeah. And that was especially true. I mean, I've been in drug development for 20 plus years. Yeah. And the sheer sort of devastation that comes from actually understanding that there's not a single clinical trial or an investigational agent that my son was eligible for was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And so for me, the hopefulness came from choosing a path where instead of waiting for a clinical trial, instead of waiting for an approved medicine, we're now going down a path of designing our own clinical trial. And it might just be an N of 1 clinical trial, but if that's enough in order for him to be able to get something rather than nothing, we might take that.
I love that. And what we talked about recently is that I like to describe that as creating a silver lining. And so I had the most amazing mother in the world. And one of the things among many that she taught me was that we should always look for silver linings in horrible times. You're in the middle of, and what you've gone through is a horrible time. I certainly have as well. We should always look for silver linings, but what's even more powerful than looking for silver linings is looking to create silver linings. So in the midst of the storm, in the midst of what you're doing or what you're going through, what I've gone through, say, what can I do today to try to create a silver lining out of this awful thing? So you're creating a silver lining, not just for your family, but think about all the other patients and their families that could be a part of these trials that you're forging ahead. So I love what you're doing, and I really, this idea of you're creating something in the midst of a horrible time.
Yeah. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is your diagnosis actually shifted your trajectory, even not just personally, but professionally. I mean, I think you were on a path to become an oncologist, right?
That's right.
Really, living through your mother's legacy in that regard. Let's talk a little bit about that, because it's also something that I'm experiencing myself.
You as well. Yeah, so for me, I had envisioned, my mom was diagnosed with cancer while I was in college, and that's what drove me to want to go into medicine, and seeing both the promise of the medications and that they were somewhat helping her, but also the limitations of those medications made me want to go into clinical oncology, but also do cancer research. And I was well on my way. I was a third-year med student when when I got so sick myself, and yeah, I had to make some tough decisions about halfway through medical school, or a little bit further into medical school after a year of medical leave, where I decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to research, and that I could never help any other patients until I figured out a drug that could save my life. And that was really, really difficult, but in the same way that you made some decisions recently, it just felt like the right thing. And I know we'll chat a bit, and something that resonates with both of us is this concept of overtime, where we've got limited time. I mean, for me, I had my last rites read to me when I was 25 years old, and I've considered that moment when, a priest was in my room reading my last rites to me to be the start of my overtime, time that I didn't think that I would have, where I need to make the most of every second. But I've also come to realize that we're kind of all in overtime. And though I can, kind of feel the clock ticking because I've got a port on my chest and I've got scars and, organs that have shut down and that sort of stuff, we're all in overtime, and that can be really scary, but it can also be really clarifying. So when you're in overtime and you have a decision to make, like, what are you going to do next? And if any of you all are sports fans, you'll know that the answer is always very clear because the clock is ticking down, and what you do next is like very obvious, and there's no time for hesitation, and it's sort of, this is what you're going to do. And that's how I feel every day. It's like, I'm in overtime, so I'm going to do the thing today that I really want to do because the clock is ticking. And it sounds like that's really what you did as well. You used your feeling of overtime to create some clarity about what's really important to me today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, as you know, I've spent the last 2 decades really focused in the oncology space. And I feel like we've been able to make tremendous progress during my time in this space, partially because of some of the medicines that I worked on, which are now shifting the survival curves across a number of these diseases, which is great. Exactly, the checkpoint inhibitors, for example, targeted therapies, for example. And when my son was diagnosed, to really see how little was being done in the rare genetic disease setting was pretty surprising to me, and just the unmet medical need. And it almost made me feel like I had a bit of a responsibility. Like, is there a way for me to channel my knowledge of the industry, how to bring medicines forward, how to make a business and create value out of these opportunities, that I felt like I really needed to channel towards the genetic diseases, because there was such a need, there is such a need.
Yes.
And that's really the reason, one of the main reasons why I came to Alltrna, because I feel like I can take that experience and really apply it in a way that can make a fundamentally different outcome, perhaps, for patients that otherwise would not be served.
I love that. I think that oncology, fortunately, is really a lot further ahead than a lot of other fields in medicine, while at the same time, of course, major unmet need.
Sure.
But I think that the more that we can learn from one another, the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network, we have the word collaborative in our name because it's just so important that we learn from one another, not just within a field, but even between fields.
So that really brings up the next topic, which I think is really important. You also shared a bit about it in your opening presentation. The impact of a fragmented, siloed world. Can you share a little bit your observations and why this concept of collaboration is so fundamentally important in rare diseases?
Oh, absolutely. So when you're dealing with a rare disease, by definition, the one thing that's common between all rare diseases is that we're rare. That's what makes us a rare disease. So we're all rare, which means that sample sizes are going to be small for studies. The amount of biospecimens for any given disease are going to be limited. Funding is going to be limited. Knowledge is generally limited. And so you have all these things working against you. And if it's a common disease, you sort of have the luxury of the fact that there aren't such scarce resources, and so maybe collaboration isn't as important. I think collaboration is important, frankly, across medicine, but I think in a more common disease, you can maybe get away with having some more silos, and right, because there's more resources and it works out. But in a rare disease, when you have such limited resources, limited numbers of patients, limited everything, you have to work together. And yet at the same time, I'm the associate director of Penn's Orphan Disease Center, and so I spent a lot of time thinking beyond Castleman's and cytokine storms, which is what my lab focuses on, thinking about just rare diseases more generally. And oh my gosh, there's so much fracturing within the rare disease community. And so for one rare disease, there may be 15 or even 50 different rare disease organizations for that one rare disease, with 15 different boards and scientific advisory boards and research programs and executive directors. And I spent a lot of time with these different groups trying to understand, why aren't we working together more? And I think in every case I've ever encountered, it's always because everyone wants to do the best for their kids and their families, and they believe that they can do better than the other groups can do. So it's not like people are doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it because they believe that the best bet, the best chance for their child is through another entity, because the other entity is not doing a good enough job. But gosh, it creates real problems all across the rare disease space when you have these fractured communities. And we were lucky in the Castleman space in that there were two organizations before we started the CDCN, and one of my good friends who's helped with all of this, Grant, is here with us today. We immediately went to talk to the two organizations that existed in the space, and we are so fortunate that one of them was just delighted to partner with us, and we actually joined our boards together, so we went from two organizations to one. And the other organization was so set in their ways that they didn't want to partner that they ended up sort of, kind of working themselves out of business because they weren't partnering with the other two organizations. So lucky in that way in Castleman's, but I know that you've seen fracturing in the rare disease space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly true. I mean, even in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is what my son has, I mean, there are a number of different patient groups. They all do great things.
Yes.
But I mean, even with my own son's example, I mean, you talk about biospecimens. My son's biospecimens are everywhere, right? They're just everywhere. And they need to be, because I'm trying to explore all different opportunities and avenues, and they're not sharing, right? So to me, it's one of the things that we just have to do. But to me, what really it makes me think, and it also makes me think so much, especially in my current role, is not just as mom, but also as CEO, is, is there a way, right? Is there an opportunity for us to incentivize what I would call co-opetition, right? Maybe, yes, we cooperate, but perhaps there's also some competition there as well. If we inspire that, if we incentivize that, is there a way for us to be able to get the most out of what we have access to and apply it to these rare communities?
I think so, and I think that there are some great examples out there. I hadn't heard the term co-opetition, but I think that there are some good examples of that sort of spirit, right? And so, we've seen it thus far since we launched EveryCure, that companies that compete with one another, companies that charge millions of dollars for access to their tools and their data, are making those data available, for free, because they believe in the fact that my data could be useful to help patients with drugs that otherwise wouldn't be used. And so, and of course, far beyond our work, there's certainly great examples. When you and I were chatting about this earlier, we talked about, are there ways for some of the rarest of rare diseases to sort of de-risk any one of our approaches by all throwing money into the hat to work on X rare disease, and in throwing money in the hat, we're also throwing ideas into the hat of, for what could be done for this or that rare disease. And then, whichever idea ends up being the one that helps the patients, maybe that group gets a bigger cut of the pie, but that we're all de-risking by all going in together. And I don't know of any specific examples like that, but your comments really inspired that idea.
I think that there's absolutely an exploration somewhere in there for us to be working towards. So it's something that back in my mind is absolutely something that needs to be understood and explored a bit. So let's switch gears a little bit. And you talked about it also in your intro, and you also just mentioned it now about this concept of being in overtime, where every second counts, every moment needs a purpose, right? Which is something that I fundamentally agree and really resonates with me a lot, just as a person, and actually has even before my son was diagnosed. Let's talk about the sense of urgency. The situations that we're in, clearly the situations that you've been in when you've had your episodes and really not knowing whether or not you were going to live to have another day. What do we think about the sense of urgency? Can you share a little bit of that patient perspective there, and maybe how you've applied it in your work as a researcher?
Absolutely. I think that the COVID pandemic gives all of us a sense of what's the kind of sense of urgency that all of us with rare and horrible diseases feel every day, right? You know, when you've got a disease like Castleman disease or Duchenne's, you have a very clear sense for just how, like, we need a drug yesterday, not today. We need drugs and we need treatments right away. And I think we all felt that with the COVID pandemic, right? And of course, thinking about Moderna, a part of the Flagship family, and the amazing work that was done to develop a vaccine so rapidly, and also therapeutics so rapidly for COVID, that's where we all had this sense of urgency. We all felt like we were in overtime, because the truth is we all are in overtime, but COVID really gave us that sense, not just, I mean, for everyone, right? You know, we all could feel like, you know, at any moment we could get this horrible infection. So I think it created the sense of urgency that all of us have always had in the rare disease and in a devastating disease space. And so, yeah, I think the big question is, how can we sort of bring that feeling of urgency to everything that we do? And, you know, I said earlier that living in overtime can be really terrifying. And I think that we, again, during the pandemic, I think there were many moments of feeling terrified, but it can also be really clarifying. And so if we can think, okay, this is the kind of sense of urgency we should always have, and then let's use that to hone in on the things that we should really focus on, I think that could make a major difference in medical research. And I might throw out a couple of specifics, and then would love to hear your thoughts. But you know, one is the fact that there is this emergency use authorization from the FDA, which allows researchers and companies to identify, you know, things that look really promising right now, and we've got a major issue, so let's try them, let's keep collecting data, see what happens. I think a similar sort of process that could be available outside of the setting of an emergency would be great, because again, you could argue that there's an emergency right now for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, there's an emergency right now for Castleman's patients that don't respond to the drug that's saving my life. So can we create a sort of emergency or an urgency situation for novel opportunities? And then the other one I'd bring up, and you probably won't be surprised, is just around repurposing, right? So, you know, you have both an urgency to find drugs, and at the same time you have drugs that are in the pharmacy that might be within walking distance of you or someone you love. And it's right there. And we just don't yet know that it could be a treatment for you or someone you love. And to me, that feels like an emergency too. The fact that the treatment could be right there and we just haven't done the work to make the link. Or maybe someone has done the work, but we haven't lifted it up and done the clinical trial to prove it. And so I think both of those allow you to really accelerate progress.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole concept of repurposing is really, really important. And first of all, I'm just so thrilled, right, that this is an approach that really worked for you. You found something, you're doing so great. And the fact that you've been in remission for 9 years, it really is an inspiration, it really is. It almost makes me really wonder, right? If these medicines are there and they exist and they may be beneficial for patients out there all over the world, you know, is there even a responsibility, right? A responsibility to really explore that and to make sure that we can truly, truly understand the full extent of their applicability.
I agree. I think I really like the word responsibility for this, because up until now, I would consider repurposing has been considered an opportunity, which is that there are drugs out there that if we can do the right work to figure out that this drug could work for that disease, then now that would be great. We could help more people. But there hasn't been, in my opinion, I think it's almost the inverse of that. It's not that, wouldn't it be great if we could find one new use among the 3,000? I think it should be that we have a responsibility as a society, not even just medical field, but as a society, to unlock the full potential of every drug. Because I mean, I really don't believe that anyone should suffer when there's a drug that's at their pharmacy. And in the same way that there have been global efforts to say that no one should suffer from a disease because they can't afford that medication, or no one should suffer from a disease because that part of the world doesn't have access to that drug. And I mean, we have, you know, brought together and overcome mountains, right, to make sure that that's not the case. And of course, there still are horrible examples where there are inequities. But it feels like the same sort of issue of equity here, that we've just got to overcome this equity access issue, that the drug is there, but the work just hasn't been done to connect this drug and this disease.
And it's kind of interesting. In my son's case, I almost felt that way also, but from a clinical trial perspective. I mean, there's innovation that's happening in Duchenne, right? At least this is a hopeful time for this diagnosis. And I hope, I believe, right, we will be on the cusp of new medicines coming in the future, which will be great. Question about whether or not there'll be cures, but time will tell. And hopefully we will be at least close to that. But the fact that he wasn't eligible for any clinical trial also felt like there was an inequity there. He was, in his case, either too old, too ambulatory, his mutation was in the wrong place, and don't get me wrong, I understand why we design clinical trials in the way that we design clinical trials. There's no doubt about it. But that to me felt like such an unfair situation for him in particular. And just to talk a little bit about the sense of urgency, the way that I see it, especially with my son's diagnosis. I mean, we're in a fortunate position in that he has a phenotype that is, I'd say, more on the milder side compared to what the typical trajectory is, which is great, but it does limit his opportunities from a clinical trial perspective. But we are still probably one major fall away from him not being ambulatory anymore, maybe one major respiratory illness away from him needing to be required to be ventilated to support his breathing. And that sounds terrible, right? And to live in a way where you don't know, is this the day he falls? Is this the day that he gets that virus? Is this the day, which can you imagine living through COVID has been tricky, right? In and of itself with that hanging over our heads. But the urgency to me is so important. Now, of course, the urgency has always been there for patients, right? It always has. I certainly saw it in the oncology setting in the numbers of years that I've focused on that particular therapeutic area. But it really wasn't until I sort of saw it through the lens of my own child where I really, really, really understood how important it is to make sure that we uncover every stone, we make sure that nothing goes unexplored, and that we push to the real furthest extents of the boundaries that science can go in order to be able to make sure that we make a difference. And we have to do it fast.
Fast, exactly. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. One thing I tell my team at Penn, and I mentioned earlier I run a center at Penn, and I tell them all the time that all of the scientific questions that we're exploring, they're going to be answered at some point. It might be 100 years or 1,000 years. Everything's going to get answered, but it's a matter of time. And so the best thing we can do is answer them as quickly as we possibly can, because it's not, can we answer it? Yes, humankind, we will answer all these questions, but we need to answer them now. and because we need to answer them now so that your son can get a drug, in a year. And it's all about time.
Yeah. So you shared your experience testing a medicine for the very first time in a disease that had never been tested in.
Yep.
It takes a lot of courage to be patient number one.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the emotions, the decision making, like how do you tackle that type of, really seeming like unfathomable situation?
Yeah, I think that it was, as you said, I think it's a situation you don't really ever want to be in, but it was, there were a lot of aspects to it that I think sort of led to me saying, yeah, let's try this drug. So first off, I've told you about my wife, Caitlin, and you read about her, of course, but one thing that I never could really understand was just how confident she was all along that I was going to find a drug that was going to save my life. And I was like, Caitlin, I wish I had your confidence. Like, I wish I was as confident in me as you are in me that I'm going to find a drug, because I really don't think I'm going to find a drug that's going to help me. I hope I do, but I really don't. So she had this like unwavering confidence. Oh, you're definitely going to. Like, you just keep working. And so I think that was helpful. Was having some real confidence in our household. I think that there's 3 things that I've found in my journey that have helped during really difficult times. And I would say, coming out of that relapse, trying to figure out a drug, working in the lab to find a drug obviously is one of them. And that's that you need to have a really good vision for your future that you're working towards. So during a tough time, you need to have something that you're working towards. So in my case, we had a wedding date. May 24th, 2014 was Caitlin and I's wedding date in the future. So that was something in the future. Again, I dreamed of a family with Caitlin. One day that was in my future. And I really wanted to keep searching for treatments for patients. I felt like I would have had some real unfinished business if I couldn't make it to finding some more drugs for other patients in my mom's memory. So one, the long-term picture, like what's your vision that you're working towards? And those were mine. Second, I really believe in the power of support from the people that you love. So when I was struggling to breathe in the ICU and when I was struggling to make decisions about whether I take this drug or not, I always had my sisters, my dad, and Caitlin by my side. And I promise you that I receive strength from them. I mean, it's like, I can tell you that like being next to them next to me, Grant next to me, like you get strength from the people that you really care about. So vision for the future, strength by your side, which is family, friends, people that you love. And then the third is really, in my opinion, it's really taking things day by day or even hour by hour. When I was, on my deathbed, it was, if you told me, David, you're gonna make it today, but you're gonna have 6 more months of this pain, suffering, everything horrible, I couldn't have kept fighting. Like there's no way if I knew it was gonna be 6 months of that, but I could keep fighting for an hour or a day at a time. And I know that's a cliche, but I think it's a cliche because I think it's true. And so during tough times, vision for the future, strength by your side, focus 1 hour, 1 day at a time. That formula, I think for me, had really been refined because I nearly died 5 times by the time I got to this point of making this decision about the drug. And so I knew what my disease could do. I knew about this thing in the future, this wedding date I wanted to make it to, and I thought this drug could work. And I had okay amounts of data. I didn't share any of it during my presentation, but had some data that could lead one to think that maybe it could be useful, but probably a 10 or 15% likelihood, realistically, that it was actually going to work. But I had a vision for the future that I wanted to pursue, and I knew that I wasn't going to make it there unless I tried something. And we talk about hope and action, and for me, it was the time to take action. So I started taking it, and I can't even put into words for you. Like January 5th, I'm like, 9 years? I just never ever could have imagined.
Yeah. Did it help that at least because you knew it was an approved medicine, even though tested in a fundamentally different population, that at least there was some foundational safety data that gave you some confidence that perhaps this wasn't going to be the one thing that threw you over the edge?
Yeah, absolutely. So sirolimus has been around for decades. It was approved for kidney transplantation many years before. It had never been used for Castleman's, but we know how it works. It blocks a part of the immune system called mTOR. The reason that I believed it could work in my disease is that I discovered that mTOR was highly active in my immune cells. And we've now discovered that that's the case across Castleman disease, though unfortunately the drug only works in about 15 to 20% of patients. We do find increased activation of this pathway uniformly across the disease. So we knew how it worked. It had been around for a long time. There was good safety data. There's actually a newer version of sirolimus called temsirolimus that one of my doctors was sort of said, well, why don't we try the newer version? And, it maybe can work better in some ways. But I actually like the idea of doing the older version that's been around for decades. And we have decades of data on it. It made me feel like we just had more insight into what it was that I was going to try. And to your point, there was a real risk that it could kind of turn me, push me over the edge. When we find out that a part of your immune system is highly activated in a disease where your immune system attacks your vital organs, which is what happens in Castleman disease, it could be that that's a compensatory mechanism, that actually there's something good about having the mTOR pathway on, and that the last thing you would want to do is turn it off, and that could actually cause problems. But again, with a horrible disease like this and with a vision for the future, it was, and a drug, to your point, that was safe and old, it was the right formula for me to start testing it.
So, but if we even think about conventional drug development, right? At some point, there's always going to be a first patient. How do you think it would be, right, to be that first time a novel mechanism, never been tested before? Can you put yourself in the shoes of that situation?
It's hard. I can certainly put myself in the shoes because I like you, have been in positions where I would, have tried anything if it meant more time with my family. So I can certainly put myself in those shoes, but I can say that I think that it's a lot more difficult to do that. And I mean, think about the amazing work that Flagship does in developing new medicines that are always being tried in the first person, right? And the work that we do in a lab at Penn, it's really, I think, heroic. You know, patients who volunteer to be that first person.
I like that you use the word heroic.
I think it is.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I mean, maybe just to share a little bit more about our situation. As I mentioned, right, we are designing a clinical trial specifically for my son using a gene editing approach that is tailored towards his mutation. He will be the first patient and maybe the last patient, right, that will be tested with this approach. I will also share with you that we are working with a group of similar families who are in a similar, unfathomable situation as we are, who are also exploring the same type of an approach. The very first patient to receive a CRISPR therapy for DMD was diagnosed just a few months ago.
Wow.
He was a hero in my mind. He was on the older side, and unfortunately, he passed away. Now, I won't speculate as to the reasons why that may have happened. There's a lot that we're going to learn from this experience. But it really makes me think and wonder about, is it worth it? Should we do this? Do we rethink our strategy? Maybe we don't design a clinical trial. Maybe we just accept the path that he would otherwise normally have. It's a lot to think through. But I will also say, when I think about that person, who is somebody actually I personally knew, the heroics of him knowing that this was a possible outcome and yet choosing to go for it anyway.
Yep.
And before he entered the clinical trial, he was asked, why would you do this? How do you have the courage? Why? And his response was, I'm doing it for all the boys, all the other boys like my son, who come in his wake, where we will learn from this experience one way or the other, and perhaps it helps give us answers to questions that we still have today. And the type of person that it takes to really be that person, I would say you're still that type of person, despite the fact that sirolimus has been used before. But we still are surrounded by those types of individuals who are really willing to step up to the plate every single day. And how grateful and thankful I am for people like that who just give it their all and make the sacrifice that you would never imagine would be necessary, but really because of the advancement of science that it can offer, and how incredible that is.
Oh, it's incredible. That's so special and so touching. Thank you for sharing that with all of us. I think that there's these incredibly courageous individuals who take, a drug for the first time ever, and there are the incredibly courageous individuals who develop those drugs and to get the drugs to patients. And I think that we're in this ecosystem where we've all got to work together because was it collaboration? What was the word you used? Coopetition, not collaboration.
That could be a word too.
That could be one too. I think we got to figure out ways, to all work together because, what you shared about this gene therapy, that you guys are using in your son's case, and sadly, the patient before your son, this is why we go into medicine, is to help these patients. Yet sometimes we can sort of get lost in worrying about a lot of other stuff. Who's the first author on the paper and things that just don't matter. And so I thank you so much for sharing that story. And I think all of us that are part of companies like Flagship and Penn and Every Cure and beyond, this is why we're doing this.
Yeah. Do you think in here there's a little bit of a lesson for us as an industry on the shifting of risk, right? Patients like you, maybe like us, certainly of the family that I just spoke about, are willing to take on this risk. But we also live in a framework where there's lots of regulations, and rightfully so, but where that risk is really tried to be minimized. Do we think that there's a lesson here about shifting risk, or the willingness to shift risk to patients, and perhaps maybe how that also could speed up innovation and drug development?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, again, going back to COVID, I think that some of the risk shifting that occurred with the federal government did lead to some things moving more quickly than they would have if risk did not shift. And so I think absolutely, I mean, in drug development, it's a lot of risk benefit and risk reward, and there's a lot of calculus that goes into decisions. So I do think that, when you think about drug repurposing, so drugs that are at your pharmacy might be helpful for your disease, and the only thing between you and that drug is a prescription pad. I mean, I made the discovery about mTOR being activated in Castleman disease about 2 weeks before I was on a medication that hits mTOR, and I recognized that a lot of doctors would hesitate. In my case, there were no other options, and I had some decent data, so that's why we did it. But when that's the case, there's this incredible opportunity, right? That like the drug's in the pharmacy, and all the doctor has to do is write a prescription, and you get it. But there's also even some risk to like the drug might not help, and it might actually cause harm, right? And so, we've got to have some sort of ability within the system to restrain, some of our desires to try a drug that might be harmful for us. But we also have to not be so paternalistic to think that, my doctor is always going to know what the right risk-benefit ratio is for me, because my risk-benefit ratio might be different from my doctor's perception of what it should be, or your family's perception of that risk-benefit ratio.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And of course, we don't want it to be the Wild West, right?
No, exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
There needs to be some measures. And of course, it also needs to make sure that we can capture all those learnings, right? Because to the point that we talked about earlier, the fragmentation, the disconnection of data, like we don't want to live in that type of world. So making sure that there's still mechanisms in place so that we can share and inform whatever the next best step is.
That's right. And it makes me think a little bit about with what we're doing with EveryCure, with drug repurposing. So one part of that play is to utilize existing data to find connection between drugs and diseases. Another part of it is to work directly with companies to understand what are the assets or the drugs that they got approved for this disease. We thought we could use it in these other ones, but we just didn't have the time or the resources. I mean, you have to make tough decisions. I think the quote I heard today was, you could do anything, but you can't do everything. And that's to say that there are diseases that you just can't pursue that drug in, and that's okay. You have to make these really tough decisions. But what's missing right now from our system is a way to share that insight with a central broker, with a Switzerland. And so we want EveryCure to be that Switzerland where anyone can share this insight. I really thought sirolimus could be useful for this disease. We never pursued it, but you guys can pursue it. And so now it goes into our database, it'll be available to the world to look into, and we might just say, hey, that's worth a $5 million clinical trial. Let's get some philanthropic dollars together. Let's do the trial that wasn't done initially. And so I think that really resonates as we think about risk, and one company may say this is too risky or too little benefit, but another company may like it. And I think that what we're doing in some ways is one company's trash is our treasure. They said this drug it's not worth doing it in this disease, but you might say actually it really is worth doing it in this disease.
So you're showing up today as your true authentic self. And I love that you just put yourself out there and you share your story with all of its challenges and with humility. I think it's really amazing. It wasn't always like this for you. You went through a period of time where you really hid your diagnosis.
That's right.
You kept it from those within the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network, as well as when you were in your MBA, you hid that. Can you share a little bit about what it's like now that you're living your true authentic self?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started the CDCN, I brought together all these doctors and researchers from around the world, and I didn't want to tell them that I had Castleman disease because I was worried that they would treat me differently and that they would see me as biased. And I think some of the stereotypes and some of the problems in our system is that we in the health profession do think of patients in a different category, which is my own problem, is our system's problem. But I didn't want my colleagues to think of me differently, and so I didn't share with them for the first year and a half of the CDCN. And then I relapsed, and I lost my hair from chemo, and came into a meeting, and I couldn't hide it anymore, and I just was like, yeah, I have this disease. And of course, they'd asked me for years, you're this Penn Med student, why are you so interested in Castleman's? And I said, well, it's a horrible disease, we got to solve it. And they're like, yeah, but you work all day, every day, on this thing, and you don't do anything else. So, why? And so, I think it finally made sense. But once I started sharing with both my colleagues through the CDCN, but then also my classmates in business school, the term that I use is it was liberating. To be able to just say like, yes, I have this horrible disease, I'm working on it. It doesn't make me a better or worse scientist. It certainly makes me, potentially, more, I don't know if the word's committed, but certainly more obsessed than if I didn't have the disease, maybe. But yes, being able to share openly has been really helpful for me. And I know that you were saying earlier that that's been helpful for you, just to be able to share part of your grieving process.
Yeah, I will say that this was somewhere, that you and I deviated from. Right?
There aren't many ways we deviated.
Many ways.
It's very similar.
But this was one that it was. And when my son was first diagnosed, other than, me mustering the courage to tell my parents, which, by the way, I did via text because that's how hard it was.
Yes.
I found it almost necessary to tell somebody, to say the words about my son's diagnosis, because it almost, yes, was part of the grieving, but also the coping.
Yes.
And maybe a way to really normalize the situation and not hide from it. It just was part of my recovery, right? My steps towards recovery. And now I talk about it all the time. It is part of who I am. It's not something that I shy away from. It is also something that's so important because it drives me as a person. It really does. It drives me as a person. It drives me as a leader. It drives me in everything that I'm doing at Alltrna. And to me, it's just part of who I am. And I can't imagine it not. In fact, when I look back at pictures of myself and my family from more than 2.5 years ago, before we got the diagnosis, it's like I almost don't recognize the person. Because I know that that's a person that wasn't a DMD mom.
Wow.
And then I had a kid who didn't have DMD at the time. Of course he did. We just didn't know. But it almost feels like that wasn't really our family. And now this is our family. And that's something that we've just truly embraced. But I also will say that I'm the kind of person that does believe in transparency and honesty and being forthcoming and putting your chips on the table. Because I do think that that's a way for us to get the most out of ourselves and each other, and it's just how I lead.
I love it, and I think that what you also realize is that all of us have our own things that we're dealing with, right? And certainly different in many ways, but certainly we're all dealing with challenges. And when you can be authentic and open and share yours, it can make them feel more able to share their challenges as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so grateful for you to be able to share yours as part of this dialogue today. I'd like to sort of round up here with a little bit of a passage from your book, which of course you can see how much I've admired. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to read just for a moment. So maybe just to the point you were saying, each of us has challenges that we're facing. I hope that you'll reflect on and find your Castleman disease, or that thing that you're hoping for and passionate about that motivates and inspires you. Something that will change the world, your world, or a loved one's world for the better. And if it happens to be champion Castleman's, all for the better. That's great too. We all have the tools, though some of us need sharpening, and to chase after and even solve those problems. Turning hope into action isn't ever easy, and the fruits such labor take time to develop. But you just have to start it. Start small, do something, anything you can do to get closer to what you're hoping for, even if it seems like it's just routine paperwork. Here you talk about my greatest regrets on your deathbed were actions I didn't take. Don't let those same regrets be yours. Think it, do it, and make every second count, because the truth is we're all in overtime.
Thank you.